Something extraordinary just happened, something the political establishment never expected. For years, the old guard has lived comfortably inside a bubble of lobbyists, donor dinners, and backroom promises. They've pushed policies that quietly extract resources from ordinary people while protecting entrenched power. But this week, that bubble popped. Zohran Mamdani, one of the few lawmakers who still speaks like a human being, stepped onto the floor and said the one thing career politicians fear more than anything: your policies are anti-people. And instantly, the panic began. You could see it in their faces, in their rushed statements, in the sudden attacks on his character. Because when someone exposes a system built on quiet exploitation, the system fights back. Tonight, we're breaking down why this moment matters, what Mamdani actually revealed, and what the political elite desperately want the public to ignore. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. You can almost feel the tension in the room when Zohran Mamdani speaks, not because he's yelling, not because he's dramatic, but because he says the one thing politicians aren't supposed to say out loud. And this moment, the one that sent half of Albany scrambling for their talking points, didn't come out of nowhere. It came after months of rising frustration, tenants facing eviction notices at record rates, families spending half their paycheck on rent, workers losing hours of their lives in a transit system literally falling apart, and an affordability crisis that even the most optimistic economist would call unsustainable. People are tired. They are stretched thin. And the disconnect between what the public experiences and what lawmakers claim is widening like a crack in old concrete. So when Mamdani finally said, "Your policies are anti-people," it wasn't a slogan. It was a reflection of reality, the kind the old guard has spent years pretending doesn't exist. Because here's the truth nobody wants to say but everyone knows. The people who've been running the show for decades don't live the consequences of their decisions. They don't ride unreliable buses. They don't panic when rent goes up $400 overnight. They don't worry about safety, transit, or rising living costs. Their world is a different universe, quieter, safer, and padded by donor checks and political connections. These are long-term incumbents, many of whom have built their careers on carefully polished moderation. Not real moderation, the symbolic kind. The kind that looks like balance but is really just fear of upsetting the donors, the developers, the lobbyists, the same people who show up at fundraisers with smiley photos and checks worth more than a working-class family's monthly income. So when Mamdani used the phrase anti-people policies, he didn't just critique legislation, he went for the jugular. Their moral legitimacy. He challenged the story they've crafted about themselves for years, that they are the adults in the room, the responsible stewards of public policy, the sober protectors of what's realistic. Realistic for who? Affordable for who? Accountable to who? That's the question they can't answer. And that's why they panicked. The reaction was almost immediate. You could trace it like a shockwave through the system. Press statements came out using all the usual words: misguided, unrealistic, inflammatory. You saw subtle attacks in media pieces that painted him as too ideological or too young or too impractical. You even saw a few colleagues trying to dismiss him with that classic political condescension: he doesn't understand how government works. No, he understands exactly how it works. That's the problem. Because what Mamdani exposed, in one clean, moral statement, is that much of the political establishment is built on a contradiction. They talk like they are fighting for the public, but they vote like they are protecting private interests. They present themselves as guardians of stability, but the stability they defend is the stability of donors, not families. This is why their panic was real. It wasn't over the words. It was over what those words unlocked. The possibility that people might finally notice that the responsible adults have been mismanaging things for years, while telling everyone else to be patient. Mamdani broke the script. He challenged the myth. And that's what terrifies them. Because the old order isn't afraid of disagreement. They thrive on controlled disagreement, the kind that stays within boundaries. What they fear is someone naming the truth out loud. And that truth is about to take us into something even bigger, not just what they reacted to, but why those policies were built that way in the first place. That's the real story. If you really want to understand why the old guard erupted the moment Zohran Mamdani used the phrase anti-people policies, you have to look at the policies themselves, not the speeches, not the slogans, not the press conferences. The policies. Because policies tell the truth politicians are too afraid to say out loud. And when you examine them closely, you begin to see a pattern that is impossible to ignore. Let's start with something simple: luxury development incentives. Year after year, New York hands out tax breaks to luxury developers, billion-dollar companies whose buildings are filled with investment units, empty apartments, and rooftop pools. Meanwhile, working families can't even find a one-bedroom they can afford. The data is public. In many NYC neighborhoods, rents rose faster in the last 3 years than in the previous decade combined. Developers hit record profits. And the city? It got more glass towers and fewer affordable homes. Who benefits? Not the people watching this video. Not the family working 2 jobs. Not the immigrant household splitting rent 5 ways. It's the donors. It's the lobbyists. It's the same elite class that shows up at campaign fundraisers and writes checks with 6 zeros. And that brings us to the next part of the crisis: underfunded public transit. The MTA, the lifeline of working-class New Yorkers, has been teetering on budget gaps for years. Outdated infrastructure, decades of deferred maintenance, and chronic underfunding have created a system where millions of workers rely on trains that break down more often than they should. According to MTA reports, fare revenue still hasn't recovered from pre-pandemic levels, leaving a multi-billion-dollar hole. But policymakers still drag their feet on solutions like fare-free transit or proper operational funding. Instead, they lean on fines, fare hikes, or debt. So the people who can least afford it end up paying the most. Again, enter people. Then there's the slow walking of tenant protections. New York has one of the highest eviction rates in the country. Thousands of families every month are pushed out of their homes, often due to sudden rent spikes or landlord harassment. Tenant advocates have been begging for good cause eviction protections, a simple policy that would prevent arbitrary and massive rent hikes, yet somehow this legislation always gets delayed, stalled, or stuttered to death. Stuttered, not passed, not implemented, not defended. Stuttered. Who delays it? Lawmakers who receive significant donations from real estate lobbies. Lobbyists whose entire business model relies on instability for tenants and flexibility for landlords. You start to see the two-tier system Mamdani was pointing at. One system for the donors who want deregulation, tax benefits, and political access. Another system for everyone else, the people quietly absorbing the cost of every policy failure. And this is why Mamdani's language caused such a violent reaction inside the political establishment. He didn't just say your housing bill is flawed or your transit funding is insufficient. He said something far more dangerous to the system: your policies are morally wrong. He challenged the philosophy behind the policies, the operating principle that government exists to balance interests, when in reality it has been balancing them in just one direction for decades. Think of it like a scale. On one side, millions of ordinary people, on the other, a handful of donors and industry groups. The scale always tips the same way. And the old guard has the audacity to call that pragmatic governance. But here's the kicker: if these policies were truly defensible, if they genuinely served the public, they wouldn't panic when someone calls them out. They'd debate him. They'd confront him with confidence. They'd welcome the conversation. They didn't. They scrambled. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about why people, ordinary working people, actually trust Mamdani's message more than theirs, and why that trust is becoming a political threat unlike anything the establishment has seen in years. There's something almost refreshing, almost disarming, about the way Zohran Mamdani speaks. He doesn't use the polished, consultant-tested vocabulary you hear from career politicians. He doesn't hide behind phrases like stakeholder alignment, public-private partnerships, or complex legislative pathways. No. He speaks plainly, morally, and as if the people listening to him actually matter. And that's exactly why his message hits so deeply with ordinary people. Because here's the truth we don't say often enough: most people are not waiting for another 40-page policy memo. Most people are not looking for a Harvard-style breakdown of zoning law. Most people just want someone to finally say, in human language, what they already feel: this system is not working for us. And Mamdani says it without flinching. Younger voters hear him and feel seen, not talked down to. Working-class families hear him and feel understood, not studied like data points. Immigrant communities hear him and feel represented, not tokenized. Why? Because his language isn't bureaucratic. It's moral. And moral clarity is powerful. It cuts straight through noise, complexity, and political theater. It gets to the heart of the matter: what's right and what's wrong. You see this in his record. This is a politician who openly pushes for fare-free transit, not because it polls well, but because he knows what it feels like for a family to choose between a MetroCard and groceries. He fights for tenant protections, not because it's trendy, but because he represents communities where eviction isn't an event, it's a monthly fare. His proposals build authenticity. Not the artificial authenticity you get when a politician rolls up their sleeves for a photo op. The real kind, the kind that comes from lived experience and clear values. Now compare that with the old guard. Their speeches sound like they were assembled in a conference room. Their responses are always, we need to study the issue, we're exploring long-term solutions, or we're balancing multiple stakeholders. Stakeholders? Most people can't even balance the rent and the electric bill. And that's part of the larger story. People today don't trust institutions the way they used to. According to national surveys, trust in Congress, trust in local government, trust in the media, trust in the system, all near historic lows. Americans increasingly feel that the rules are written for someone else. They feel like outsiders in their own country's political process. So when someone speaks with moral clarity, with no fear of elites, no fear of donors, no fear of being called radical, it resonates across age, class, and even political lines. Because at its core, Mamdani's message isn't left or right. It's about dignity. It's about fairness. It's about not being walked over by people who pretend to care but never deliver. There's a bipartisan emotional truth at play. People feel unheard. People feel pushed aside by institutions that claim to serve them but rarely do. People feel invisible. And when someone breaks from the script and speaks like a neighbor, not a bureaucrat, it shakes the entire political order. And this is why the elites feel threatened. Because authenticity doesn't just expose corruption, it exposes incompetence. When someone speaks plainly, the excuses stop working. When someone tells the truth, the spin collapses. When someone shows they're actually listening, the old guard suddenly looks like they've been asleep for years. But here's the real danger for the establishment, and the real power for the people. Mamdani's message isn't just resonating, it's spreading. The moment Zohran Mamdani called their policies anti-people, the establishment didn't respond with debate. They responded with defense, fast, coordinated, and very familiar. Because when someone threatens the machinery of power, the machinery doesn't argue, it retaliates. And the first weapon they reach for is always the media. Not the loud, obvious attacks. Those are too easy to spot. The establishment prefers a quieter blade, selective editing, subtle framing, and op-eds posing as reasonable criticism. Suddenly, Mamdani is too extreme. Not realistic. A risk to stability. You see the pattern? They don't challenge his facts. They challenge his tone. Because tone policing is how the powerful avoid talking about the substance. It's how they turn moral clarity into a PR problem instead of a political truth. Then comes the second wave, donor panic. Real estate groups, luxury developers, corporate landlords, these are people who are perfectly comfortable with the way things have been. They rely on tax breaks, subsidies, deregulation, and political access. When someone threatens to redirect even a fraction of that power toward public needs, the alarms start ringing. Lobbying groups issue carefully worded concerns. Donor networks quietly ask lawmakers, is this guy becoming a problem? Fundraisers dry up. Pressure increases. Not because he's wrong, but because he's interrupting the revenue stream. And this is where the political machine steps in. Every government has a machine, a system of rewards and punishments that keeps members in line. If you follow the script, smile for the cameras, don't question the donors, and vote with leadership, you rise. If you break ranks, even once, well, suddenly your committee assignments shift. Your bill doesn't get brought to the floor. Your endorsements evaporate. Your campaign funding becomes just a little harder to secure. It's punishment wrapped in professionalism. Nobody says it out loud. That would be too honest, but everyone in politics recognizes the message. Sit down. Fall in line. Don't embarrass the people who control the money. Bureaucracy works the same way. When reformers push for bold ideas, fair free transit, tenant protections, affordable housing guarantees, the bureaucrats don't say we refuse. No. They say something softer, more polite, more deadly. It's not feasible. We need more data. We can't rush the process. We have concerns about implementation. Translation. We don't want to change. We don't want new priorities. We don't want to disrupt a system that has protected us for decades. And you don't have to look far for historical parallels. When Bernie Sanders questioned Wall Street's power, the donor class mobilized. When Ilhan Omar criticized U.S. foreign policy elites, the media reshaped her words and framed her as dangerous. When AOC challenged corporate tax deals, she was portrayed as anti-business, despite being one of the few lawmakers arguing for actual economic fairness. These aren't isolated incidents. They are the playbook. Because this is a narrative war. The establishment's favorite word is stability. They say it with pride, as if stability is inherently good, even when the stability they are defending is a system where inequality grows, housing collapses, and working people fall further behind every year. Reformers use a different word: justice. Justice disrupts. Justice exposes. Justice demands change. And when justice enters the room, stability starts shaking. So the panic you're seeing, the op-eds, the donor pressure, the bureaucratic stalling, isn't random. It isn't emotional. It isn't spontaneous. It's coordinated. It's strategic. It's the system defending itself. Because the one thing the political establishment cannot tolerate is a moral critique, one that names, clearly and confidently, who the system serves, and who it sacrifices. If you step back for a moment, really zoom out, you start to realize that this entire confrontation isn't simply about housing, or transit, or one lawmaker calling out a broken system. This moment is part of a much bigger story about who government in America is actually designed to serve. And once you see that story clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because at its core, politics in this country is split between two philosophies. Not left versus right. Not Democrat versus Republican. But something deeper. politics as service to people versus politics as management of donors. For decades, the political establishment has mastered the art of acting like the former while practicing the latter. Every press conference, every campaign promise, every carefully packaged bipartisan compromise is meant to create the illusion that public welfare is the top priority. But when you follow the money, when you track the votes, when you study the outcomes, you see something very different. You see how Mamdani's statement, "Your policies are anti-people," doesn't just critique individual bills. It punctures the illusion that elites govern out of moral duty. It reveals a hard truth: many politicians govern to preserve the comfort of those already in power. And this isn't just a New York phenomenon. It's national. Look at healthcare. Every year, Americans pay more for healthcare than any other developed country. Yet millions remain uninsured or underinsured. Why? Because the system protects insurance companies and pharmaceutical giants, industries that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying. Look at corporate subsidies. Billions in taxpayer money flow to corporations that post record profits while workers struggle to afford groceries. It's public money funding private abundance. Look at labor protections. For decades, unions weakened, wages stagnated, and gig work exploded, not because that's what the public wanted, but because that's what corporations demanded. Both parties permitted that erosion because both parties are entangled in the same donor networks. This is the real pattern Mamdani tapped into. This is why his statements spread beyond his district and resonated across the country. Because people feel the consequences of this system every day. Families priced out of their own neighborhoods. Workers commuting 2 hours because the city they serve no longer serves them. Communities losing identity as developers bulldoze history to build investment towers. And ordinary people silently watching as the political class pretends everything is under control. These aren't policy issues. They are emotional wounds. They are reminders that the system has made its choice, and the choice wasn't us. So when Mamdani names the truth directly, without fear, it sends shockwaves. Not because it's new, but because it's rare. Because most politicians, even the well-intentioned ones, avoid crossing the invisible line. The line where criticism stops being symbolic and becomes structural. The line where you stop discussing problems and start discussing power. And that's the heart of this chapter. This isn't a fight over transit or zoning. This is a fight over the very purpose of government. Is the state supposed to protect the public? Or is it supposed to protect the people who already control the economy, the land, and the political narrative? The future of American politics depends on whether more leaders are willing to cross that line, to speak plainly, morally, directly, without sanitizing the truth for donors or editorial boards. But it also depends on something even more important: whether the public demands it. Because when the public stops accepting excuses, when people refuse to be talked down to, when voters raise the cost of silence higher than the cost of courage, that's when real change becomes possible. And that is the real story here. Not the panic, not the pushback, but the possibility, the question of whether this moment is the beginning of a shift in power, or just another warning ignored. The answer to that lies not in Albany, but with the people watching now.